Welcome to Herdley, where each book is distilled into a chronological story, offering you a special journey in just minutes. Today, we study together Andrea Elliott's Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City, in which we probe into the intersection of generational poverty and systemic failure, revealing how institutions meant to protect can sometimes harm the very people they are designed to help. Andrea Elliott is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. Don't go away. Herdley, the editor, will be right back with the story. Dasani, an 11-year-old girl, wakes each morning to the sound of her siblings breathing in a cramped, decaying room at the Auburn family residence, a homeless shelter in Brooklyn. It's 2012, and Dasani's world is one of constant instability, shaped by poverty and the ever-present threat of displacement. Her family, consisting of her mother Chanel, her stepfather Supreme, and 7 siblings, live in a single room where mattresses are spread across the floor and a mop bucket serves as a toilet. The harsh conditions of their reality are inescapable. From the mold sprouting from the rusted sink pipe to the mice and roaches that invade their living space, Dasani's childhood is a far cry from any sense of normalcy. Chanel, her mother, carries the weight of the family's struggles, navigating a complex welfare system while battling her own demons, including a history of addiction. Yet, Chanel never loses sight of her role as a mother, even when things are at their worst. In her own words, Chanel declares, "If I don't pull through, who's going to pull through?" Her resilience, though frayed, is the backbone of the family. However, life in the shelter is full of unpredictable challenges. Auburn's mice always return, as Dasani bluntly observes, marking the ongoing battle between survival and dignity. In school, Dasani's outward confidence hides the daily struggles of living in a homeless shelter. Despite her circumstances, she is determined to succeed, fueled by her dreams and a fierce competitive spirit. She makes the honor roll, driven by the need to rise above her situation. But at every turn, poverty chips away at her. She attends school in second-hand clothes, and although she longs to fit in with her peers, Dasani cannot escape the stigma of being from the shelter, known to other kids as a shelter boogie. Dasani's life is a delicate balancing act between holding her family together and forging her own identity. With each passing day, she contemplates the world outside her shelter, full of wealth and opportunity, which seems impossibly distant. Yet, in her mind, there is still hope. A hope fueled by the skyscrapers she sees in the distance and the dreams she holds close. As she looks out from her window, she imagines a better life, telling herself, "I have a lot of possibility. I do, though. I have a lot of things to say." This part of the story underscores how poverty, especially in urban settings, strips away not just material comforts, but also the ability to hope freely. Dasani's dreams are in constant conflict with her immediate reality. Her story highlights how systemic issues, underfunded shelters, ineffective welfare systems, and the challenges of public education fail to address the needs of the most vulnerable. As we move forward, we are reminded that Dasani's struggles are not only her own, but a continuation of a generational cycle. Her family's history of hardship stretches back decades, revealing how deeply entrenched poverty can be. This legacy of struggle sets the stage for the next part, where we explore the roots of Dasani's family's plight. Long before Dasani was born, her family's battle with poverty had already been set in motion. The roots of their struggle stretch back to 1835, when her ancestors were first subjected to the brutal realities of slavery in the American South. Through the years, as the family moved north during the Great Migration, seeking freedom and opportunity, they were instead met with a new form of hardship: systemic racial oppression. By the time they settled in Brooklyn, the cycles of poverty and marginalization had taken hold, shaping the lives of Dasani's grandmother, Joni, and her mother, Chanel. Joni, born in 1950, grew up in the projects of Brooklyn, her childhood filled with both the comforts of community and the harshness of economic hardship. The hope for upward mobility, promised by the civil rights movement, never materialized for her generation. Instead, the projects became a trap, with limited access to education, healthcare, and employment. Joni worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, yet never managed to escape the pull of poverty. As Chanel recounts, the street became our family, a reflection of how, for them, survival often depended on navigating the informal networks of the impoverished community, rather than relying on institutions that continually failed them. In the 1980s, when Chanel was growing up, the crack epidemic ravaged Black communities across America, and Brooklyn was no exception. Chanel's childhood, already fraught with instability, became more chaotic as drugs flooded her neighborhood. By 1990, Chanel, like many others around her, fell into the cycle of addiction. Her life became a mirror of the systemic neglect her family had experienced for generations. She lost custody of her children multiple times, entered and left treatment programs, and struggled to find work, all while living in public housing that was deteriorating around her. By the early 2000s, Chanel had started a family of her own, but the same systemic forces kept her and her children trapped. Welfare benefits were unreliable, public housing was overcrowded, and jobs were scarce for someone with her history. Despite all her efforts to shield her children from the world that had swallowed her, Chanel found herself repeating the same patterns of instability that had defined her mother's life. In her own words, "How can I pull up any straps with no boots?" A sense of helplessness, passed down from one generation to the next, seemed impossible to shake. This generational narrative reveals a much larger issue than one family's misfortune. It's the story of how structural inequities, rooted in racism and economic disparity, can trap families in poverty for generations, making it nearly impossible to break free. The forces that shaped Joni and Chanel's lives were not just personal failings, but reflections of broader systemic failures. These include inadequate housing policies, poorly funded public services, and a legal system that disproportionately punishes the poor. As we transition to the next part of Dasani's journey, it's clear that the struggle her family faces is not just a fight for stability, but a fight to break free from a history that has bound them for decades. The pressures of generational poverty are pushing them to a breaking point, setting the stage for the critical moments of upheaval and root shock that will soon define Dasani's story. By 2013, Dasani and her family's fragile existence in New York City had reached a critical point. The constant instability of their living situation, jumping between shelters and the streets, had left deep emotional scars. Dasani, now older, was acutely aware of the system's failures. The promise of public assistance, child protection, and welfare had had become a bitter joke. They keep saying they're here to help, but they just make it harder, her mother Chanel would mutter, reflecting a sentiment shared by many trapped in the cycle of poverty. Dasani's family had long been under the watchful eye of New York City's child welfare system, and it wasn't long before the situation reached its breaking point. The tension at home, compounded by Chanel's ongoing struggle with addiction and Supreme's unpredictable temper, led to a moment that would change everything. The children were temporarily removed from their parents' care, scattering them to different foster homes across the city. The fear of separation, a nightmare that haunted Dasani and her siblings for years, had finally materialized. It was during this period that Dasani first truly understood the term root shock, the deep psychological upheaval caused by being torn from the only sense of home and stability she had known, however chaotic it might have been. Living in the shelters of New York had always been a battle for survival. But now, without the presence of her siblings or her mother, Dasani faced an entirely new challenge. She had to navigate foster care, the uncertainty of where she might live next, and the feeling that no place was safe. Every day felt like a struggle against an invisible force, something much larger than her immediate circumstances. This was the point where the systems meant to protect, child services, shelters, public housing, felt less like safety nets and more like traps, tightening around the family with every interaction. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Dasani continued to fight. She clung to the hope that she could one day pull her family back together. In her mind, the only way to escape this reality was through education and sheer determination. She threw herself into school, determined to be seen not as a victim of her circumstances, but as someone who could rise above them. Her resilience, while remarkable, was tested every day by the harshness of her environment, where dreams often died before they could be fully realized. The toll of root shock became evident as the months dragged on. Chanel's efforts to regain custody of her children were met with endless bureaucratic hurdles, while Supreme's presence in their lives became more sporadic and unstable. The system, meant to protect, had instead deepened the fractures within the family. Dasani, once full of hope and ambition, began to feel the weight of it all, unsure if there was any way out of this cycle of despair. This part of Dasani's journey paints a vivid picture of the emotional and psychological impact of displacement. The constant instability, the looming threat of family separation, and the failure of institutions to provide real, lasting support have profound effects on the children's ability to grow, to learn, and to believe in a better future. As we move forward from Dasani's experience, we're left asking, how does a child recover from such deep-rooted trauma? How do they rebuild a sense of self and family after everything they know has been stripped away? At the heart of this story lies the painful truth that systems meant to help often perpetuate harm, especially for those trapped in generational poverty. One story that stands out is when Dasani, despite her family's overwhelming struggles, takes it upon herself to fix a dripping sink in their shelter. Nobody thought about pushing it in and twisting it, she remarks, before successfully repairing the pipe herself. In a shelter with a $9 million budget, it was an 11-year-old girl who managed what the system could not. This small act of resilience highlights a larger tragic irony. While institutions fail, The burden of survival is placed on those least equipped to handle it, children like Dasani. This moment is a microcosm of the broader theme explored in this narrative. Dasani's family, like so many others, has been caught in a cycle of poverty, addiction, and displacement. Yet they constantly find themselves let down by the very systems designed to assist them. Their battle for stability in an unforgiving environment reflects how institutional failures amplify the difficulties faced by the most vulnerable. In reflecting on the key argument, we see how deeply entrenched systemic problems turn poverty into an inescapable cycle. Dasani's story, though painful, serves as a stark reminder of the need for genuine support structures that empower rather than hinder. As the editor of Hardly, by learning from the above, we can focus on building environments where stability, not survival, becomes the foundation for children's futures. At the heart of this story lies the painful truth that systems meant to help often perpetuate harm, especially for those trapped in generational poverty. One story that stands out is when Dasani, despite her family's overwhelming struggles, takes it upon herself to fix a dripping sink in their shelter. "Nobody thought about pushing it in and twisting it," she remarks, before successfully repairing the pipe herself. In a shelter with a $9 million budget, it was an 11-year-old girl who managed what the system could not. This small act of resilience highlights a larger, tragic irony. While institutions fail, the burden of survival is placed on those least equipped to handle it, children like Dasani. This moment is a microcosm of the broader theme explored in this narrative. Dasani's family, like so many others, has been caught in a cycle of poverty, addiction, and displacement. Yet they constantly find themselves let down by the very systems designed to assist them. Their battle for stability in an unforgiving environment reflects how institutional failures amplify the difficulties faced by the most vulnerable. In reflecting on the key argument, we see how deeply entrenched systemic problems turn poverty into an inescapable cycle. Dasani's story, though painful, serves as a stark reminder of the need for genuine support structures that empower rather than hinder.